They work their way through this.
Good morning, radio listeners. Welcome to the real side of business. I'm your radio host, Dr. Eric Smith, and I am part of the Rhema Gospel Express here with Elder James Lockhart and Lady Rosa Lee. I tell you what, radio listeners, I have a special treat for you this morning. I have a good friend of mine and a colleague tonight. Has been known now for over a year. I feel like I've known him a lot longer than that.
Right.
And I want to welcome Mr. Jimmie Morris. He is a licensed professional counselor. And we are going to talk to you about the difference between psychological abuse and other types of abuse. I feel the subject is very important that's going on in the communities as a whole, affecting the communities negatively, or something that impacts families in a negative way. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Jimmie Morris and let him tell you a little bit about himself, and we're going to go right into the subject.
Great. Well, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for the opportunity. As you said, my name is Jimmie Morris. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a leadership coach here in the San Antonio area. I really enjoy working with folks to help them with personal development, with being able to grow and mature in their mind as well as their spirit. I enjoy working with executives, managers, teams, and I've also got specialized training in working with domestic violence. I specifically worked in that area for a couple of years, and I've got specialized training in working with families and groups as well. I'm really appreciative to hear you say that this is a topic that does impact the community, because a lot of folks have this misgiven notion that domestic violence is something that only is a concern for the particular couple that may be involved with it. And that's not true, because domestic violence impacts not only the couple, but it also impacts the children. It impacts the taxes that we pay, the school systems. It also affects the medical health care system as well. So all of us should have a vested interest in learning more about this topic and what we can do to help change it.
Great. Let's go into what are some of the common myths about domestic violence?
Well, that's a great question, because there are, unfortunately, today in our culture, there are a lot of myths that exist about domestic violence that should be clarified. And that first myth is that domestic violence is a personal issue between a married couple, as I alluded to earlier. Domestic violence affects everyone in the family, especially the children. And if you are not married, or you don't have a vested interest by way of this particular area, you should still be concerned, because like I said, this is hitting your pocketbook. The tax dollars that you are paying to help the programs that are being offered and offset throughout our school systems, the healthcare system, the economy at large. According to the American Psychological Association, about half of the men who abuse women also abuse children.
Wow.
And so this is something that has a ripple effect. There are so many different areas that are impacted. It's not a personal issue between a married couple. And myth number 2 is that it only happens to poor women or to minorities. This is not true. Domestic violence can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic background is. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. All of us can experience domestic violence. Every socioeconomic and racial group. I've personally counseled individuals, both male and female, from various backgrounds and walks of life who have dealt with this personally. It can be found in every class. And it's unfortunate. We've seen here recently in the San Antonio area on the news, there seems to be an increase of cases where emotional abuse, which I know we'll talk about in more depth here in just a moment, has escalated into physical violence. And this is where we want to intercede before it gets to that point to where there is physical violence that actually occurs. But that's myth number 2. Myth number 3 is that she deserves to be hit. And you wouldn't believe how many times I have heard this in working with batterers and those who are going through rehabilitation, through parole programs, through probation programs. The reality is that no person deserves to be abused, period. The abuser is responsible for the violence, not the victim. You know, being irritated, being frustrated, all of us experience what that is like. But that does not justify violence. And as a counselor, working through resistance with a batterer can be very, very challenging. And it can take considerable effort and time to work through the blame, which is what we're talking about right now. Nobody deserves to be hit. You have to recognize, if you are of this mindset, that it's wrong. And downplaying your part and shifting responsibility, whether that's being in complete denial, where you don't even acknowledge that abuse has occurred, which is especially a problem with regards to psychological abuse, justifying, which is when you acknowledge what you've done, but you may even recognize that it was wrong, however, you defend it because of what somebody else did. So, for example, if you hadn't turned the channel when I was watching the Cowboys, then I wouldn't have had to have gotten up and got physical with you. This type of nonsense. You know, these are ways that batterers often rationalize their abusive behavior, which leads them to believe that the other person deserves to be hit, which is clearly wrong.
And also, too, it's also a form of control.
Absolutely.
And when you want to control someone, you can limit them around their friends, limit them trying to get to work, which is called employment hindrance tactics. Today, you know, Jimmy, they can also use texting.
Yes.
That's the number one thing, because that text can go straight to that person at work, and that employer have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
But it can hit and hinder that person working, hiding keys, ripping up clothes, burning them. And all these tactics are designed to control people. What else you have?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Myth number 4 is that alcohol is the cause of domestic violence.
Wow.
You know, the reality is that there is no drug, including alcohol, that causes domestic violence. I know a lot of alcoholics who have never been involved with domestic violence. You know, there are plenty of batterers who blame alcohol to prevent taking responsibility for their own actions. Alcohol is not the cause of domestic violence. Again, it's the abuser's choice. And then the 5th and final myth that I wanted to mention is, this is one I often heard while counseling men who were guilty of domestic violence. If she didn't like it, she'd leave.
Wow.
Yeah, see, this is what you're talking about. Power and control. That's what it's all about. Intimidation, threats, coercion, fear, this anxiety about possibly losing the children. An abusive relationship is the only type of relationship that some people know.
Wow.
And how sad is that? It's so important for us to help them understand that they deserve better.
And you know, Jimmy, this is why when we look at TV today, some of these reality shows, in order to get higher ratings, they have to overemphasize the acting in which, people throw things at each other, men and women. People, break things. People engage each other with such hostility. And one person tried to go one up on each other every time and turn the situation around, or even stop men from leaving, to the point of saying, hey, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to kill you while you go to sleep, and things like that. And we have a gamut of tools that people use to try to control and abuse each other. And which leads us to the next point I want to talk to you about, get your thoughts on. What are some of the examples of psychological abuse?
Well, the first example of psychological abuse is the use of insults.
Okay.
So we're talking about name calling. I've had people admit to calling their spouse or their partner things like cow, pig, orca, stupid, idiot, many other profane names that I won't mention here. But the pathetic thing is that there are those who actually think that this type of childish is funny. They'll mask it in some sort of a joke. And then if you don't laugh about it, then you're the problem, you see. But this is a tactic that people will use that's emotionally abusive. And it's really sad, again, because they don't recognize their own immaturity. Verbal put-downs are another example of the use of insult. Maybe they don't use profanity or call you things like pig or orca, but they put you down by saying things like, hey, Chunky, how much weight have you gained this week? Right? Or I knew I shouldn't have married you. Or maybe they'll just blatantly say, I just don't care what you think. See, this is emotional abuse that we're talking about here. Telling people to shut up, or saying things that are condescending like, well, at least I got a job. See, this is psychological abuse. Using abusive language that's directed towards someone else in private or public. When we start getting into this mentality that, well, this is my house and I'll say whatever I want to say, that is psychological abuse, and it's wrong.
Exactly. One time I was in Florida, and I was actually walking into the Walmart, and I heard a young lady talking to the top of her voice. And it was actually a young man sitting down there who didn't say a word. And she was telling him how he needed to be responsible to his kids, and how he needed to go out there and be a man, and I allow you to be a man. And she was saying it where the whole parking lot can hear her. So somebody got tired of it and actually called the security guard, who came around there, and she's yelling and screaming at the security guard, you need to mind your business. This is our business. But how could it be your business when you're out there in the parking lot for everybody to hear you? And it's stuff like that that I've seen parties do on both sides that need to stop. And people need to realize that is psychological abuse.
Yes.
That destroys the fabric of relationships, whether you have a partner or not, and it applies to any type of relationship.
Yeah, well, it's just so good to hear that somebody had the courage to speak up and to say something and not allow that type of a problem to perpetuate. Because if you hear it, you own it. And if you don't do something about it, then you're part of the problem.
Right. And people do, people say things these days, well, this is my business. You need to go ahead and mind your business. Don't tell me how to live my life. But it's these stupid things outside that people hear, that people speak about. And like you said earlier, they try to justify their behavior. But your behavior is injuring others.
Yes.
And this is an awareness that I'm glad you came on the radio station as part of the Rhema Gospel Express, that we're trying to promote in the community, not only the San Antonio community, but all the radio listeners across the country, to let them know hitting someone is the last resort. But there is an escalation that leads up to that hitting. So What are some of the ways people can avoid being in an emotionally abused relationship?
Well, I've got some tips that I'd like to share that can help folks to be able to avoid being in an emotionally abusive relationship. And the first one is don't bargain for love or respect.
I think you better say it again. I think somebody missed that. They was on the way going to Golden Corral.
Yeah.
So let's say that again.
Right.
All right.
Don't bargain for love and respect. And let me quickly acknowledge that in some cases, it is certainly appropriate to compromise, to negotiate. There's got to be some give and take in a relationship, but not when it comes to love and respect. See, abuse comes in different forms, and whether it's psychological, physical, or sexual, it's unacceptable. Expressing love and respect is a non-negotiable when we're talking about a healthy relationship. You know, this is where you got to watch out for the mistaken notion that sacrificing yourself can save someone else.
Wow.
We're not interested in sacrificing ourselves and becoming martyrs or becoming codependent or our self-esteem suffering to the point to where we start to question our own value. See, this is what this all leads to. I counseled a mother who struggled with this. Divorced from her husband while her son was just a baby, she felt guilty that her son didn't have a father as he's growing up. And over time, her son, he became defiant, became rebellious. And I know that there's probably a lot of listeners who are in this similar situation. He was disrespectful, became abusive towards his own mother, towards other family members, had a hard time controlling this boy. And after becoming an adult, guess what happened? Her son was arrested. And the mother was heartbroken and continued to blame herself because she thought that she just hadn't sacrificed enough.
Wow.
See, and that's a lie. And instead of letting that young boy take ownership for his own actions, you know what she did? She took a second mortgage on the house to get him out of jail and to pay the attorney fees. And within a year, he ended up arrested again for a separate incident, and the mother ended up homeless.
Wow.
See, don't bargain for love and respect. That is something you've got to avoid. And then secondly, refuse to conform because of fear. See, martyrs can hide behind the mask of being a good person, of being unselfish, but it's really just a way to avoid conflict because of a low self-esteem. This type of avoiding behavior, it hinders the opportunity to discover more about who you are as a person and who you are capable of becoming. So that's number 2. Number 3, sacrifice selectively.
Okay.
See, this is not an all or nothing type of a situation. There are times and places where sacrifice is necessary. It's even ennobling. And there's a big difference when a mother sacrifices, getting her nails done so that she can feed her children versus another mother sacrificing her entire career for her child. So it's not all or nothing. Avoid extremism. Think about sacrifice among adults in relationships or sacrifice among colleagues at work. We've got to be able to apply this in all of our relationships. When does sacrifice become problematic? Sacrifice becomes problematic when you deprive your own dignity in an effort to get validation from others. That's when it becomes a problem. You end up working so hard to try and please other people that you end up betraying yourself so that you can be accepted. See, this leaves you feeling empty and bitter. Number 4, own your own potential. We've got people who are listening to us right now who have potential to become things they never imagined. Ralph Waldo Emerson said it. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. You got to own your potential and realize that you don't have to be dependent on somebody else's affirmation, somebody else's ability, somebody else's acceptance to be who you want to be in life. So I hope that this has been beneficial with thinking about some things that are very practical that we can do to avoid being in this type of a situation.
And that's why it's time to make a change. But the change starts in your mind. When you change your mind, you'll change your situation. And that's why there's no such thing as a no-win situation. If you can see opportunities, you will always get rid of the obstacles.
Yes.
And this is why this is so important. If you have any comments, you can dial in right now for a few minutes and we'll be here to answer your questions at KRV 785-9227. You can dial in right now, 210-785-9227. Or if you continue and you like this broadcast, please email me at smithej450@gmail.com. smithej450@gmail.com. Hey, Jimmy, if they want to get in contact with you, how can they reach you?
I would ask folks to visit my website at jimmiemorris.com, and Jimmy is spelled with an I-E. There are a lot of free resources on my website. I also host a podcast myself called Psych Sessions, and they can download those podcast episodes for free, listen to them at their convenience. I've got multiple podcasts that actually specifically address women's issues, men's issues, the topic of domestic violence, and there's also lots of resources by way of free videos as well. Dr. Smith, I was going to ask you, do I have time to mention a couple of other things about some of the other examples of emotional abuse?
Of course we do.
You know, there are a couple of other things that I've thought about that I'd like to also share, because this is something that I've also recognized in counseling not only those who are committing domestic violence, but the victims of domestic violence, and that is the silent treatment. You know, the silent treatment and refusing to discuss things that someone else wants to talk about, and how important that is. And you know, a common tactic that an abuser will use is to treat you like you're not a person. They'll devalue you. Now, how do you know if this is happening? Well, number one, they'll refuse to call you by name. Now, think about that for a moment. When is the last time that you were in a relationship where you had someone actually address you by your name, as opposed to some sort of patronizing nickname that they may have assigned to you, that you've told them before, please don't call me that, but they continue to do it? It's used as a mean of taking away someone's individuality. See, and it's a common tactic that we see with this type of strategy to dehumanize groups of people as well. And this is something that perpetuates from not only individuals, but to stereotypes.
There you go.
And so it's so important for us to nip that in the bud, just like this person that you talked about earlier when you were at the store, who had the courage to speak up.
And that's why stereotypes, biases, minimizing people's achievements, all of this happened in the business environment. And that's why, you know, people try to rebut, say, well, people are just so sensitive these days. No, they're speaking up because they're tired against police abuse. They're tired against family abuse. They're tired of all these types of issues that are impacting the community in a negative way. And domestic violence is not a home issue. It's finding its way, and it has always been in the workplace.
Right.
Again, Jimmie Morris, thank you so much for coming by the Real Side of Business radio broadcast. I am Dr. Eric Smith, and I am glad to be a part of the Rhema Gospel Express. Remember, it's time to make a change.